Welcome to Reform Thinking.
It's good to be here.
Today, we are taking you back about, 300 years or so to a controversy that might sound purely academic,
It definitely sounds that way on the surface.
but it actually governs so much of how we understand human nature, responsibility, and even salvation. We're looking at a battle fought by Jonathan Edwards, one of the most brilliant minds in American history.
And it all hangs on one seemingly simple question.
What does it mean for the will to be truly free?
That's right. For those of you listening, this is really a masterclass in philosophical warfare. Edwards wasn't just, engaging in some minor debate. He correctly saw this specific controversy, the definition of the will, as the linchpin.
The linchpin for what?
For everything. It either upholds or it completely demolishes the orthodox doctrine of original sin. If you change this one definition, the entire building of Christian theology, at least as the Reformers understood it, just falls over.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The target for the opposition was original sin. They were trying to completely get rid of the idea that a condition, an inherited nature, could be sinful.
Right. But to do that, they had to go for the foundation first. They had to attack the will.
And that's what we're digging into. We want to uncover why Edwards saw this as the hinge that almost all Christian doctrines swing on. Our sources show Edwards was taking on a theological movement, and he represents them with a figure he just calls Dr. T.
And Dr. T was trying to make man the autonomous, self-originating cause of his own moral status.
So our mission today is to unpack this opposing definition of freedom. They called it self-determination, this idea of radical autonomy.
And then, and this is the really fascinating part, to analyze Edwards' logical arguments that show why this position is just riddled with crippling self-contradictions.
It all comes down to a core high-stakes question, a question that you can still hear in discussions about blame and justice today.
And that question is, can a condition, a disposition, be called sinful or blameworthy if it's inherited, if it's unavoidable, and if it didn't come from a specific choice that you made?
Let's start with some context. I mean, terms like Pelagian and Arminian can often just sound like, historical jargon. So who were Edwards' opponents, really, and what was their big goal?
Edwards puts them into three buckets, basically. You have the ancient Pelagians, the later Arminians, and then the modern divines of his own day.
And what did they all have in common?
They all shared a very high view of humanity's natural moral ability, especially when it came to the will. The ancient Pelagians, for example, they argued that humans are born morally neutral, like a blank slate.
So from birth, we're perfectly capable of choosing good without any kind of special divine help. And sin is always just a specific choice we make later on.
Well, that's the core of the Pelagian heritage, yes. Arminianism, which came later, sausaged that a little bit. They'd often talk about a kind of prevenient grace or common grace.
But they kept the main idea.
They kept the central principle, that the human will must have the ultimate self-determining power to accept or reject God. Otherwise, they argued, man isn't morally responsible. For them, accountability required the power to choose otherwise.
And Edwards points to this figure, Dr. T, as a major proponent of this view. Now, Edwards used the pseudonym because he wanted to focus on the argument, not the man, but we have a good idea of who he was talking about.
Oh, yes. The critique was aimed at prominent voices in the Arminian camp at the time, people like Daniel Whitby, who was very influential in arguing against the Reformed position. Dr. T was an aggressive critic of the Orthodox consensus.
And Edwards noted that this idea of freedom, this was their grand favorite point. It was the single most fundamental piece of their entire religious system.
They really believed that if you could just prove this one definition of freedom, everything else they taught just followed naturally.
And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, especially for us today. Edwards saw that the implications went way beyond the church. He suggested that the arguments the Arminians were using would also build a strong fortress for the deists.
Why would that be? How would a theological argument about grace help deism?
Well, deists believed in a clockmaker God who doesn't intervene. They often rejected things like special revelation or miracles because they seemed to contradict human reason.
I see. So if Dr. T's definition of freedom is true, if morality requires total human autonomy, then a lot of doctrines that Edwards believed were plainly taught in Scripture start to look unreasonable.
Doctrines like what?
Like sovereign election or efficacious grace. Those doctrines seem to contradict this philosophical idea of what's fair for a moral agent. Edwards saw them throwing out Scripture's plain teaching on human depravity in favor of a man-made standard of reason.
So they were specifically going after the official reform standards. The main target was a proposition from the Assembly of Divines, the writers of the Westminster Standards.
And that proposition states that man is by nature utterly corrupt. This standard teaches that the corruption is so deep it affects the whole person, including the will, making him unable to choose spiritual good on his own.
And Dr. T's response to this?
He was not subtle. He explicitly declared the Westminster proposition to be false, just straight up false. And he felt totally justified because his whole framework, this idea of self-determination, just had no room for the idea of a natural inherited corruption.
Which brings us right to the point of conflict. Why couldn't he accept it?
Dr. T argued that sin simply cannot be natural or necessary. This is the heart of the whole thing. The Orthodox Reformed view is that a sinful disposition is part of our nature at birth. It's what we inherit from Adam, a state often called habitual depravity.
And if that state is natural, Dr. T says that means it's necessary. It's unavoidable, something we can't help.
Exactly. And for him, the conclusion is obvious. If it's necessary, then it cannot be sin, and we can't be blamed for it. Dr. T just sees it as illogical and unjust to assign moral guilt or condemnation to a condition if that condition is inherent and unchosen.
It's like punishing a stone for falling.
That's a perfect analogy. He's saying it's a category error. And that sets the stage perfectly for the key battle, which is all about definitions. To really get why Dr. T's objection felt so powerful to his followers, and frankly why it's still so appealing to many people today, we have to drill down into his foundational premise, this specific radical definition of freedom he required.
Okay, let's spend some time here. Because as you said, Edwards himself claimed that there's no one thing more fundamental to the whole Arminian system than this definition of the will.
If they lose this point, they lose everything.
So let's unpack it slowly. They define the freedom of the will as consisting in the will's self-determination. What does that actually mean?
It means the will is like an independent, autonomous agent. It has its own power to determine its own acts, without being determined by anything else external or internal.
So not determined by motives or your own inclinations.
Right. Not by previous motives, not by inclinations, not by any antecedent cause. When the will acts, it acts because it chose to act, period. And it could have chosen otherwise no matter what came before.
So the will isn't just following the strongest desire it has. It's actually creating the desire for its own action. It's radically sovereign over its own choices.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this self-determining power, they assert, is absolutely essential to moral agency. Dr. T and his allies claimed it was, quote, necessary to the very existence of virtue and sin.
In other words, if an act is caused by some prior necessity, or if it just flows out of a necessary state of being, it loses its moral quality.
Completely. It just becomes a natural event, like the tides rolling in. Without this specific type of freedom, the ability to choose independently of any internal necessity, an act can't be good or evil. It's just a predictable, unblameworthy motion.
And that leads right to their key principle. Nothing can be sinful but what proceeds from our choice.
That is their non-negotiable line in the sand. Moral fault demands an active, chosen volition. You can't be blamed for a passive state of being or an inherited condition. Guilt needs the signature of a self-determined choice.
Let's use that legal analogy again. Imagine a court system where blame is strictly tied to voluntariness. You can't be fined for your height or your eye color or for having a genetic disease you were born with.
Right, because you didn't choose those things.
So Dr. T applies that exact rule to the soul. Being born with a corrupt nature, a state you didn't choose, is morally irrelevant. Guilt only starts the moment the will, which was previously neutral, actively and independently chooses a corrupt act.
The whole framework is built in direct opposition to the idea of necessity or unavoidability. Since the Orthodox Reformed position says the disposition to sin is there at birth, Dr. T says, well, then that sin is natural and therefore necessary.
And the conclusion for them is logically bulletproof. If sin is necessary, it cannot be sin. And that's how they can just declare the Assembly of Divines proposition to be false.
Right. They aren't arguing that man doesn't sin. They're arguing that the state of being born corrupt can't qualify as sin because it's unavoidable.
Edwards saw this immediately. He saw the strategic stakes. He even conceded that if this particular peculiar notion of freedom, this radical self-determining will, could be established, it would give his opponents an impregnable castle.
It would make them logically invincible against the doctrines of grace.
Let's trace that out. If the will determines itself, that creates a huge problem for the idea of God's sovereignty and salvation. So how does changing this one definition undermine the rest of Reformed theology?
It's a domino effect. First, if sin has to be chosen, then original sin, the inherited corruption, is gone. Man starts out neutral, or at least close to it. Second, if man starts neutral, he must have the natural, autonomous ability to choose good. Third, if he chooses good autonomously, then his conversion is kicked off by his own self-determined choice, not by God's exclusive, efficacious grace.
Which means doctrines like the sovereignty of grace and election are just subverted. If the difference between one person being saved and another being lost is just the autonomous choice of the human will,
the grace isn't sovereign, it's just enabling. Man becomes the deciding factor. The efficacious operation of the Holy Spirit, which the Reformed position sees as this necessary divine intervention to make a dead will alive, that becomes unnecessary. Or at least it can't be compulsory.
So the Holy Spirit can only persuade or enable, but the final decision has to be left to the uncaused choice of man.
Correct. And that shifts the credit, the true initiative for salvation, from God to man. This is why Edwards said that settling this one point governs the outcome of almost every theological controversy. It's the keystone holding their entire system up.
So if Edwards wants to defend the orthodox position, that we're born corrupt and we need sovereign grace, he can't just argue about original sin. He has to first go and destroy their definition of the self-determining will.
And that's exactly what he does. Let's quickly review the specific arguments Dr. T used to tear down that Westminster proposition, because seeing how confident he was is key to appreciating Edwards' counterattack.
Right. Dr. T was very insistent on where blame must reside. He argues that the cause alone is chargeable with blame, not the effect. This is central.
It's his way of making sure that moral responsibility only sticks to acts of will. If a man has a corrupt nature that he didn't choose, that's the effect. He can't be blamed for it. He can only be blamed for the specific, active, self-determined choice, the cause, that leads to a bad action.
Let's go back to that self-driving car analogy. Dr. T is basically saying that if the car crashes, you can only blame the programmer who wrote the code. Or you could blame the car if it decided to rewrite its own code.
That's the self-determination part.
Right. But if the crash was just due to factory-installed, necessary code and inherited flaw, then the crash itself is innocent. The only thing you can blame is the original choice to install that code. And since we didn't choose our inherited nature, that corrupt nature can't be our sin.
And this argument from necessity is the one he leans on the most, according to Edwards. Dr. T insists more upon the argument from necessity than any other.
And the logic flows like this. 1, if a disposition is natural or inherited, it's necessary, unavoidable. 2, if it's necessary, it can't be a fault because fault requires choice. 3, therefore, original sin has to be rejected.
And to tie it all up, Dr. T dogmatically asserts that sin has to originate from a disobedient will.
Meaning there's no such thing as a passive inherited sin. He says Adam's sin came from his disobedient will and, quote, so must every man's sin and all the sin in the world be.
Every single sin has to trace its lineage back to a preceding self-determined choice. If it didn't come from a chosen disobedient will, it's not sin, period.
And this creates a system that seems on the surface very tight, very rational.
But Edwards argues that this rational system is wound so tightly around its own narrow definitions that it just starts to choke itself. His counter-critique is so brilliant because he doesn't just reject the conclusion. He shows that the very premises Dr. T uses are contradictory.
He makes it impossible for their own system to explain moral reality.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. Edwards stops defending and goes on the attack, laying siege to Dr. T's fortress of self-determination by exposing 3 growth inconsistencies.
Right. Before Dr. T went about declaring the orthodox view false, Edwards says he really should have checked to see if his own system was collapsing under its own internal strain. And these aren't small flaws. They're contradictions that destroy the very definition of moral agency they were trying to build.
Let's start with the first one. This one deals with separating the moral quality of the choice, the cause, from the moral quality of the action that results from it, the effect.
Dr. T tried to split them apart.
And Edwards shows that's logically impossible.
Okay, so let's review Dr. T's 2 non-negotiable claims again. Claim A. Nothing is sinful unless it proceeds from our choice. That's the effect.
Right. And claim B, the cause alone is chargeable with blame, not the effect.
So if we accept claim B that only the choice, the cause, is blameworthy, then the effect of that choice, whether it's telling a lie or a resulting state of depravity, can't actually be sinful.
But wait a minute. If the effect isn't sinful, then how can the choice that produces the effect be blameworthy? I choose to lift my hand. The effect is my hand moving. That choice is neutral unless the effect is morally relevant.
Like choosing to lift my hand to strike someone.
Exactly. The choice to lift your hand only becomes wicked because striking the person's wicked. If the resulting action, the effect, isn't morally blamable, then the self-determining choice that produced it is just a neutral action.
Edwards' reduction here is just paralyzing. If only the cause is to blame, the effect is innocent. But if the effect is innocent, the cause is just a neutral motion and is also innocent. Sin just vanishes.
He summarized the contradiction perfectly. He said, "Nothing can be sinful but the effect of choice. And yet the effect of choice never can be sinful, but only the cause." The logic demands that sin exists only in the effect, the action, but responsibility exists only in the cause, the choice. By splitting them, Dr. T makes it impossible for sin to exist under his own definition. He's created a system that logically removes guilt from the world.
Let's use that arsonist analogy again. Dr. T is saying the crime is only the volition to strike the match, the cause.
And Edwards points out that if the resulting fire, the destruction, the damage, is declared innocent because it's just an effect, then striking the match isn't arson, it's just lighting a stick. It's only a wicked choice because the result is wicked. You cannot hold on to the moral quality of the cause while stripping it from the effect. They're tied together. By insisting on separating them, Dr. T collapses moral accountability itself.
Wow, okay, that's the first one. What about the second, inconsistency? This one seems like Edwards' most powerful blow because it prevents Dr. T's system from even getting started.
It does. It attacks the very origin of sin within the self-determination framework. The premise Dr. T holds is simple. If a choice is sinful, it has to come from a previous, self-determined choice to be blameworthy.
Why?
Because sin must always come from choice, and that choice must be the cause.
So if I make a sinful choice right now, that choice must have been caused by a prior sinful disposition, which in turn must have been caused by a prior self-determined choice to adopt that disposition.
Precisely. The logical chain has to go backward. This sinful choice came from an earlier sinful choice, which came from an even earlier one, and so on.
But that can't go on forever. It has to eventually reach a prime or original active choice in the sequence, the very first volition toward evil.
And here comes the checkmate. This very first act, by definition, cannot proceed from a previous choice. It's the beginning. Since there's no prior choice to cause it, Edwards notes that it is, quote, necessary as to us, or at least it's not caused by a choice.
Oh. And if we apply Dr. T's own fundamental rule to this original act, the rule that if it's necessary or uncaused by a choice, it cannot be sin.
Then the origin point of all evil must be declared innocent.
That's the breakdown.
It is. Dr. T's system needs sin to have a chosen origin, but the origin itself, by the structure of the argument, cannot be chosen. So the ultimate foundation of all subsequent evil, under their own system, has to be innocent. If the source of the river isn't wet, how can the river be wet? If the first act of will toward evil is innocent, how can any subsequent act that flows from it be guilty?
That is genuinely paralyzing. So if sin can't start with a blameworthy act, it can't exist at all, according to their own rules. They successfully protect man from inherited sin, but only by making the initial responsible act of sin logically impossible to begin with.
Edwards' analysis just showed that the self-determining will, defined as a choice uncaused by any prior inclination or necessity, is a fiction. It requires an uncaused cause for moral evil, and then immediately argues that this uncaused cause can't be sin because it wasn't caused by a choice. The system eats itself.
So what's the third inconsistency? This one, you said, is about the internal state of the sinner before the sin happens.
That's right. And this is where Edwards points out that Dr. T is forced to make concessions about human nature that directly violate his core argument against original sin. It's focused on Adam's first sin. Dr. T had to explain how Adam, who supposedly started out morally neutral, fell.
And what was his explanation?
Dr. T asserted that Adam could not sin without a sinful inclination, or a disobedient will existing beforehand. This inclination is what produced the act of choice.
That sounds reasonable enough. I mean, no one chooses something without an inclination toward it, right? But for Dr. T, this admission is lethal. He even concedes that the moral law forbids these latent principles of sin.
Wait, if a latent principle of sin, a sinful inclination, is forbidden by the moral law, then it is, by definition, sinful.
Exactly. And Edwards immediately asks the crushing question. If the sinful inclination exists before the sinful act, how did the man get it?
Dr. T insisted that all sin must proceed from a self-determined choice. But if this inclination precedes the first choice, it cannot be the result of that choice. It has to be an antecedent, unchosen state.
Which is the direct contradiction.
It is. If this inclination does not proceed from a choice, it violates Dr. T's foundational rule that nothing can be sinful without proceeding from a chosen act. Dr. T is forced to admit that necessary unchosen dispositions, these latent principles, can be sinful principles, and that directly undermines his entire objection to original sin.
So he argues against the sinfulness of an inherited nature on the grounds that it's necessary and unchosen, but then he admits that Adam's first sin required a necessary, unchosen, sinful inclination to exist first.
He's applying two different standards, one for the inherited nature of all humanity, and another for the internal state of the first human.
That's precisely Edwards's point. Dr. T's scheme requires him to say that nature, if unchosen, can't be sinful, but then he has to concede that sin requires a sinful nature to exist before the choice happens. The internal logic just fails.
Edwards argues that Dr. T's doctrine is therefore philosophically false, and that any impartial judge, seeing the impossibility of this definition of moral agency, has to reject the Arminian platform.
It's so clear that Edwards wasn't just debating scripture here. He was using pure logic to show that the Pelagian Arminian view of freedom doesn't just disagree with the Bible, it makes moral life itself unintelligible.
It does. It creates a moral agent who has to be radically autonomous to be responsible, yet who, in that radical autonomy, is incapable of initiating the very first blameworthy act necessary to account for sin's existence in the world. It's an exercise in futility.
So we've established that this conflict over original sin is really, at its root, a conflict over the definition of freedom. The self-determination view tries to create a moral agent who is totally divorced from any necessary inherited state.
They're trying to make man autonomous in the origin of his own sin. And conversely, Edwards understood that if the will is determined by the strongest motive or inclination, and if man is born with a necessary inherent inclination toward evil, then conversion must be a sovereign act of God to change that inclination.
The will is still free in a sense.
Yes, free in the sense that it acts according to its strongest desire, but its desire, its nature, is corrupted.
This definition of the will really is the piece holding the entire theological structure together. If you alter this one piece, defining freedom as radical autonomy, the whole structure of Reformed doctrines, from how we understand guilt to how we see divine rescue, it all just collapses.
Right. If the will determines itself, then we don't need efficacious grace. We just need persuasive encouragement. If sin must be chosen, then we aren't born lost. We just make bad choices, and we're capable of making good ones.
This historical discussion is so relevant for today. It shows you that these abstract theological definitions have radical practical effects on how we understand our nature, our guilt, and our need for rescue. I mean, whenever you hear modern discussions about moral failure or the nature of human evil, you're hearing echoes of this 18th century debate.
Is evil something inherent, or is it always just a series of poor choices?
Exactly. Understanding this battleground helps you identify the core conflict in any religious or philosophical discussion about human nature. It forces a decision. Does freedom lie in the ability to choose without necessity, which is the Arminian position?
Or does freedom lie in the ability to choose according to one's inclination, even if that inclination is necessarily corrupt, which is the Edwards position?
Edwards admitted that his opponent's view of the will, if it could be logically established, would be an impregnable castle against Reformed theology.
But he showed, through rigorous logic, that their castle was built on sand and internal contradictions. He made their premises impossible to hold.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
It does. If moral fault must proceed from a self-determined choice, as Dr. T insists, then the source of all good choices must also be self-determined. This raises a huge question about God's grace. If we need salvation because we are incapable of choosing good, but moral responsibility requires autonomous choice, what does this say about the nature of God's grace if that grace has to somehow intervene before the will makes its first truly good choice?
So we'll leave you with a challenge.
Consider whether true freedom is simply the ability to choose without compulsion, or whether true freedom is the restored ability to choose what is truly good. An ability Edwards would argue only sovereign effectual grace can restore.